The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Welcome to the Lighting Controls Podcast, everyone. We got a great guest for you today, Caleb Thompson. He's going to talk to us about engineering and submittal level specs. Definitely worth checking it out. But before we get into that, just want to let you know that this episode is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA.
And financially supported by NAIL, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And if you have not yet checked out the lightingcontrolspodcast.com, be sure you do, because you can find all of our episodes from there. You can find all of our sweet merch, like the shirts and the coffee cups and the hats and all the other cool stuff that we have out there. You can find all of us. You can find us all on social media, on all the different platforms from there. All the links are in the website, and of course, your favorite streaming platform. And now, here's Caleb.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Lighting Controls Podcast, where we're passionate about lighting controls and we like talking about it. So here today, we have Caleb. Caleb, you want to give us a brief breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Sure, yes. Caleb Thompson. I am an electrical engineer with DFW Consulting Group. I do obviously mostly electrical equipment, but I've experience doing a lot of lighting controls. A lot of my companies that I've been with were more almost submittal level with lighting controls. So I've been able to get in pretty deep with those and develop relationships with the controls manufacturers as well as design people. So it's developed into somewhat of a passion, although it's kind of steered into it. But I've really enjoyed being able to learn quite a bit on it. So.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. I mean, I think a lot of us find different ways that we get sucked into the cogs of the lighting controls world. And so it's interesting to hear, that you said that the submittals was really part of it. But I'm curious, what aspect of it drew you in? Like what about the workflow that you're doing?
Well, for me, I'm kind of a puzzle person. So when I see something I don't understand, I like to dive deep into it, try to gain an understanding. And so lighting controls was that way for me. There's a lot of interesting aspects to lighting controls. There's a vision that a client and end user is trying to get with their lighting controls. When they picture it, they're picturing, okay, how do I want this to look? I have, a picture on the wall I want to highlight, or maybe I have just a wall graphic, and so we get like a linear wall wash or something. So how do they achieve that? What type of lighting controls actually fits to what they want? And so being able to dive into that has really been a passion for me, since being able to figure out what best fits my client, what best fits my end user. And so that's where my passion is for lighting controls.
No, I mean, I think I share the same kind of aspect, and I would say a lot of lighting control specialists out there have a similar sort of mindset of like, okay, what is the puzzle that I'm trying to solve here? What is what is going on? How do I understand this? And so I think it's interesting because it's such an abstract thing. You don't actually have a physical component that you can say, yes, okay, this is showing me that it's working the way it's supposed to work. Like a light fixture, you turn the light on and the light comes out of it, and the quality of the light can be measured and observed, and whether or not it meets your specification is really easy to ascertain. Whereas with controls, it's so theoretical. It's like, okay, I push a button and then a whole host of things happen after I hit that button.
Right.
And so you've got this I like to call it the Rube Goldberg machine of lighting controls, because it's just basically this cascade of events that happens right after that. And so, one of the things that I like to say is, there's the end user experience, which is you push a button and a light turns on. And then there's the reality, which is you push a button and then that button actuates something, and then a relay closes, and then this happens, and just kind of spirals from there. So, from your perspective as an electrical engineer, what what specifically about lighting controls could be improved upon in our industry right now?
Honestly, I think the lighting controls have been really great. A lot of it's starting to become towards standardized to, what a client expects and what's expected in construction. I think what best could help, um, propel that would actually be more on the contractor side. How do we get the
Mm,
contractors understand what they're building for the client? A lot of the times, the issues are miswiring. That happens
mhm.
quite
Hmm.
often out in the field, and
Yep.
it's unfortunate for the end user because they experience that after the fact. So
Right.
I think finding a way to actually make it easier or at least better understanding for the contractor would actually do a lot more at this
I think
point.
that aligns with with a lot of things that Ron and I have heard, which is
Yep.
education and outreach and
Hmm.
consensus of terminology. Because as far as the contractor is concerned, I mean, they are under the wire. They need to install stuff, and it's
Hmm.
almost like
Hmm.
every manufacturer out there has their own procedure for something. And if they don't
Right.
follow that procedure precisely, then things go awry. And so, to
Hmm.
your
Hmm.
point, like with miswiring, I mean, miswiring is a really common issue because of the fact that, well, the terminal block on this manufacturer shows it this way, whereas the terminal block on somebody else's manufacturer
Yes.
may show it a completely different way.
Right. Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
I mean, just take DMX for instance, right? I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of 3 different wire types that are approved for DMX. You know, I mean, there's far
Right.
more than that, right? But I'm thinking specifically of 2 Belden wires I know of that are almost interchangeable with each other, and Cat5, and they're not always interchangeable at the fixture end, depending on the termination type and the termination block. And
Hmm.
that's confusing for a lot of contractors. Well, this one
Right.
says DMX and that one says DMX and that one says DMX. So why can't I use
Mhm.
that one? So,
Right. And DMX is definitely a whole different animal, especially for a contractor. That's hopefully they're getting someone on the field, from a lighting control specific person to help set that up. But another easy one that I could think would be good for contractors is P.O.E. You just
Mm.
plug in a Cat
mhm.
5e cord and go about your
Yeah,
day.
we had a great interview on POE from a company that does
Mm,
POE implementation, and it does really sound like a great way to just keep things consistent. I have heard on
mhm.
the flip side that RJ485 terminations take time and effort to complete, and so the pushback from some manufacturers is, well, it takes longer to do an RJ45 termination than to screw into a wiring terminal. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Mm.
Ron has some thoughts
Not
on that.
direct, not directly. I haven't had any experience with that.
Sure.
The benefit of PoE I could see is the versatility of being able to readdress your space, reprogram it. After commission if you're reconfiguring the space. So there's great stuff for PoE there. But in terms of actual connections out in the field, it's really up to the how good the contractor is. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, and
Mhm.
I think that is the same case with luminaire installation as well.
Hmm.
If you don't have a good contractor doing a good ceiling lay-in, you're going to have stuff wonky
Right.
and all over the place. Whereas, a solid contractor will make things even throughout the whole space. And
Mm.
so similarly with lighting controls, I've seen some fantastic work done where the contractor, for instance, it's a wireless sensor and it can be magnetically held to the T grid. But because it's tegular
Mm.
tiles, the tiles dip down, so you can't use the T grid. So they actually just
Mhm.
Oh
pre-install the
no.
sensor on the tile, and
Okay.
then it's
Yeah.
dead center in the tile and it's ready to go. They just pop it in, which is gorgeous. Whereas other
Yeah.
people will just
Absolutely.
ad hoc, just like, it's not working on this tegular T grid. I'm going to try to figure out a workaround for this. It's like, just staple it to the tile. So I think, to your point, the skill of the contractor really does impact the
Hmm.
success of the installation.
Right. Yeah.
And so are you? So you said miswiring. What other things are you seeing that are desirable from our industry that could be improved upon?
There's not much. It's been quite well. I'd like to see more dolly systems. Maybe
Are you seeing a lot of
maybe some
dolly in your
price.
end?
No,
Yeah,
no. A lot of VE. That's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
sure. And so
But
so when you're
oh,
VEing, I'm guessing you go from dolly to 0 to 10.
right.
Is that
Yes.
the
It's
consistent one? Yeah.
mhm.
So, what does that conversation look like? I mean, I think a lot of people either get stuck in this conversation and have to retroactively work, or they,
Mm.
basically just aren't even
Mhm.
part of that conversation.
Right. Well, it depends on the firm. For on the engineering aspect, it depends on the firm. My previous companies, we were very specific. As mentioned before, submittal level on our drawings.
Hmm.
So, I'd have everything on there from, is this dimming pack 0 to 10 or ELV or MLV,
Mhm.
and to the company where I'm at now, where we purposely leave it a little more ambiguous for ease and flexibility of the contractor. Lead times are a big thing right now.
Mm.
So a lot of times there's substitutions and things when you get to the CA process, was construction administration. That's when you're looking through submittals and approving.
Mhm.
And I think if I can think on this, being able to have that flexibility, I think is key for the market right now. So
Interesting. Yeah. So what you're
mm,
saying is that less specificity is actually giving you more flexibility during the construction
mhm,
administration phase because of the fact that the contractor may sub your system out for something else, and as a result,
correct.
if you're too specific, you may hamper that fluidity from one system to the next.
Right. That's when you get into the revision, redesign for a different lighting control system. So you may on the CA approve and then say pending future revision. And so, there may be a determination from the client or end user later that they don't want the revision. And so they just get the
Mhm.
system that they want in there. And so that's why we have in our, a lot of companies have in their spec or on their lighting fixture schedule or equivalent.
Mhm.
Yep.
And
Right. And I mean, sometimes that's also because it's a public project and they need to have
Right.
right.
the
Yeah. In certain states, that's
flexibility.
required.
Right.
Hmm.
But
Yes.
I think or equivalent is pretty much a vernacular that a lot of
Hmm.
groups use nowadays because of the fact that it's like, okay, I use this as my basis of design, but it's really, if this gets subbed out by somebody else, there's going to be no one-to-one swap. Like, the devices are going to be different.
Right.
The room controller is going to
Hmm.
have
Yep.
different quantities of zones, stuff like that.
Yep.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. Especially if you're, you got a control systems that may have like a single relay or up to 3 relays, and then low voltage dimming channels with that. So you can get into a wide range of different styles controls, and that compress, expand, do a lot of certain things. So
Mhm.
in the CA process, you really want someone who understands that portion of it.
And so, do you work with your manufacturer's representatives to do this?
Hmm. Often, so we'll have like a representative. We'll reach out and we'll contact for the project, or a lot of the times, the end user or maybe even the architect will specify lighting fixtures. So
Hmm.
then we'll try to work with that. See, is there a commonality here? Is this from one representative? Is it from a next? And then with those reps, there's usually an associated lighting controls. So then we try to utilize that control.
So
And
you
then,
try to
of course,
match
okay.
the control system with the package of the luminaires.
Right.
That's an interesting.
Um,
I haven't heard that before. I've heard basically, we like this brand, so we go with this brand
mm,
versus,
Mhm.
this brand's more applicable to the project, so we go with that. Whereas with what you're doing is you're looking at the Luminaire schedule and saying, okay, these are all specified by Rep X. These are all products that are represented by Rep X.
mhm.
So we're going to go with Rep X's lighting control system.
Right. Yeah. And that's, that that tends to be relationship on, on the representative side, and then between the
Mhm.
manufacturing companies, if they're partnered together somehow, usually the process of bringing in the fixtures and then the control um, connections to those fixtures tend to be a little bit more spot on. There
Mhm.
are some fixtures that just don't play well with a different type of lighting control, and then there are special lighting controls that are packaged with said luminaires from the same
Mhm.
rep- representative. So, say for instance, Enlight type controls for Acuity brands, they have a specific fixtures that will have Enlight enabled controls with their lighting fixtures. So
Right.
it tends to hopefully lead to a better end user experience. So.
I'm
Sure.
curious though. So leaving a little bit more ambiguity and leaving your drawings during CD a little more vague, has that
Mhm.
led to additional work for you on the back end during CA to go through the submittals to make sure it's actually going to meet the intent you guys were going for?
Right. So it depends on the client and the end user. When I start a project, I typically ask them, how do you want this space to look like? Is there something you're trying to achieve? So if I look at a space, it's not going to be, say for instance, as a private office. Okay, not much going on there. But if I look at a retail showroom, and I know there's graphics on the wall or reception desk or a display of some sort, those are the kind of areas that I'm desperately trying to coordinate with them. What do you want this to look like so I can have the controls spot on? But,
Hmm.
with a little bit more ambiguity, I don't see that there's much actual difference in the CA process, because before I was still doing the same CA process as I am now, which is I check
Mhm.
the product item list when the submittal
Hmm.
comes in. I check the floor plans, the counts. I check the risers and then the sequence of operations. So I'm going through that, making sure everything is right as possible. And so I don't think that type of process should change based off of that. You really want to make sure you have a buttoned package for the end user, because at the end of the day, they're the one experiencing that when they walk in the space for the first time, and they flip on a switch and they're hoping everything looks great. They got their graphics lit up or displays lit up. And,
Hmm.
unfortunately, there might be some additional controls that they don't want required by
Yep.
code, like a daylight
Yep.
sensor
Yep.
or whatever. But, they have a vision that they're looking for. And so I try to make that happen for them.
Mhm.
So cool.
Well,
So
and
it didn't really change your process too much. If it
Mm,
saved you a little bit of time during CD, and it really didn't change
mm,
your CA process. So that's actually very helpful. I feel like for you, it's giving you some additional time back. It gives that contractor some flexibility. So I'm sure
mm.
that's made things a little bit easier for you on the back end then.
It has, and it does leave up to question, what type of lighting control submittal you're going to get. Yeah, that does tend to happen. Sometimes you get, uh, you know, some ambiguous manufacturer. Maybe the contractor's trying
right.
to get lead times or whatever.
Mhm.
But digging deeply and understanding the lighting controls when they come in is just key. So, I
Do
I have
you guys
experience with.
provide
Go ahead.
Do you provide the sequence of operations ahead of time, like during CD? Is that part of your
Mm,
standard drawing package is to provide that sequence of operations?
mhm. For the most part, yes. There are
Okay.
some stuff that's required by code, and then other
Yep.
things that kind of have to be programmed by the a specified program by the end user. So that's where we might have them coordinate that in the field with the client there.
So
Cool. Yeah, we
you
found
mentioned
that not everyone. Oh, sorry, Webb.
no, go for it, Rob.
We've
It's fine.
we've found in the past that not everyone provides the SOO like early on, right?
Mm.
Sometimes you're lucky if you get one at all. So it's nice to hear that you are providing one, and I think that ultimately helps the contractor and the rep as they're helping you to put together, or helping the contractor to put together the controls package, because having that sequence really helps tell the story and paint the final picture, because it can
Right.
be so hard to do that without that sequence.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for the commercial spaces that I tend to work on, a lot of it's just follow code. But if you're into an amphitheater or a coliseum or something, there's a whole different type of sequence of operations that have, associated with that. And, unfortunately, I haven't been able to work on one of those quite yet, but it's in my wish list, as it were. So I'm hoping to be able to dive into something like that one day and kind of help flesh out that sequence of operations at that time.
So you've been talking about energy code, and one of the interesting things about Texas is the way that they handle energy code versus versus other states. And so I was curious if you wouldn't mind just kind of walking us through how Texas differs from like, say, for instance, California.
Okay, yeah, certainly. So Texas, for general portion of Texas, there's they typically follow what's called the International Code, or International Energy Conservation Code, IECC. And depending on the AHJ, that's authority having jurisdiction, they will specify what code they want. And a lot of times that's the city for the locations. And so you'll see 2015 IECC, 2018 IECC, and then 2021. Those are probably all the ones that are in use right now. And then for certain areas, say like Dallas, for instance, you'll get into with local amendments at the end of that. And that can be something that can catch you off guard. You want to go in there and look at their codes, see what those local amendments are, where they, put a little bit of change on that. And then you also have in Dallas, Dallas green sheets. Now, I've never had to do a project with those, so I wouldn't be able to quite tell you what that is. But there's that. And then you get to places like California, where they have completely specified their own lighting, at power and energy codes. So for California, Title 24. And so they have rules and
But it's
listings, right,
basically
for both power and lighting. Go ahead.
It's basically, in California, it's sweeping across the state saying you must comply with Title 24. There might be like local municipal amendments to some degree, but it's for the most part a broad brush. Whereas in Texas, it's every single city gets their choice, and so
Right.
that's got to be really dizzying as a specifier in Texas.
Right. And, I've done work outside of Texas, and you see a similar instance across many of the different states. So, for the middle America, it's pretty much like that, where the AHJ, at the city level or university level, a lot of times will pick their own energy codes. And then places like California, if you look on the opposite side of the seaboard, there's also Massachusetts. They have their own code that's statewide, or New York, which has three different codes.
But yeah, I mean,
it can be
to
daunting.
your point, you're right. There are definitely states out there that they'll break it up a little bit. I mean, for the most part, from what I've seen, it's pretty consistent though. I mean, even with the AHJs in control, it's like, okay, state of Minnesota is adopting this ASHRAE standard, and that's it. But again, maybe an AHJ may say, no, we're not adopting that yet. But it's, I think with Texas, it comes to mind this Wild West experience of everybody has their choice of energy code, and you kind of have to pay attention to the details. And so additionally, because of that, I've heard of some owners pushing back on specifiers saying, I'm not going to provide energy code compliance. And I've heard of an engineer actually getting fired because they said you have to meet these code requirements. They fired the engineer and hired somebody else who said, okay, fine, I'll turn a blind eye to this.
Mm.
And so I was curious if you've seen or heard of anything like that on your side of things.
Right. Yes. Especially with retail, you'll have an end user that's like, I really don't want these. I really don't want these daylight sensors or occupancy sensors in here. And so the best what you could do with them is maybe include them on your emails to the AHJ and say, hey, this is a retail space specific. Is there anything that we can do here? Is there an exception? And sometimes a lot of times that'll go down to the inspector level. Like, is this going to be okay? And so doing that little extra step, showing your end user that you're in their corner, you're trying to fight for them, but it's, you've done your due diligence. The responsibility is over at the AHJ for them to say yes or no. And so I think a lot of times the end user is just looking for that. Go ahead.
I mean, it's great to hear that you're doing that. And I would agree, part of the due diligence of a specifier is coordinating with the AHJ. I'm just surprised that you've gotten responses during the specification process. Normally, from my experience anyways, if I reach out to an AHJ, they say, submit the documents, we'll review. And that's it. They basically stonewall you until it's in construction, essentially.
Right. Yes. That can definitely happen. And at the end of the day, you're just trying to do the best for your end user. If you have a happy client, you've won. Your company has won. The end user has won. Everybody that's on the team has won. And so that's what you're gunning for. Trying to make, unfortunately, in a way, a people pleaser to make sure everybody's happy. But that's what you want. Everybody wins at that point. So
definitely. No, I mean, you're. Oh, yeah. If it comes to mind, just let me know. But yeah. I mean,
go ahead.
You're spot on. I mean, I think that's the thing, and our industry really needs to do a better job of advocating and working with owners and occupants, because there's definitely this habit of well, they don't really know what they want, so I'm just gonna give them what I would do for a project of this style and be done with it and wash your hands of it. And I think that habit really kind of gets people in hot water, because it's like, I didn't ask for this. Why did you give me this?
Right. Absolutely. And sometimes you'll get into a weekly meeting and they'll discuss something like that. Like, why is this here? Why do I have to have this? Or it can come in a separate email. And then, something that I would never say in a meeting or anything like that is, after commissioning, what you do with the lighting controls is up to you. And so, whatever the end user chooses, but, per code, per HJ, and what we have to have on the drawings, we have to have those code requirements there. I will fight for you when we get into, the areas that you don't want things. And then, I will make that extra step, do that extra work for you, because I want to make you happy.
Well, I think that's great. I mean, that really goes above and beyond and makes sure that you really are defending the occupant or the stakeholders of what they want for their systems. And, that extra level really kind of pushes you ahead of the curve. I think, there's, again, I've seen so many times where it's like copy paste, or not even, and it just gets disappointing, I think, to see that, because I think as far as things go, it used to be, from my perspective, that lighting controls very simplistic. You could just get away with relays, time clocks, and some occupancy sensors where you needed them. But nowadays, it's you really need a complete holistic system almost for every single space nowadays.
Yes, absolutely. I feel the market's tending to go to more of a distributed control scheme, where you have, with all your rooms and stuff, you'll have the localized controls and you'll have the dimming packs above the ceiling, an accessible location, hopefully. um, and then, for hard JIP areas, you may see a hybrid system where due to accessibility limitations, maybe we have a lighting control panel for that area. And so I think the market's tending to get away from a complete centralized control system to a hybrid and a distributed. So
I would agree with that. I think, especially with the unknown conditions of existing buildings, for instance, it's a lot easier to have a small power pack as opposed to a big panel, because then it's like, oh, it doesn't need to be exactly over here. It can be like shifted around and maneuvered as needed. And so I think, to your point, having that distribution is really the key for a lot of contractors on sites. And I when it comes to centralized, I think the other thing is that we were dealing with bigger loads back then. Nowadays, LED loads can be 2 watts.
Oh yeah. LED loads, I typically see around 10 to 30 watt level, and then compare that to what the luminaires were before, which was those fluorescent fixtures. They were 80 to 150 watts. So LED has really propelled us in a good direction to where we could specify more lighting for certain areas and still be under that footprint of what there was there before, and that gives more flexibility to the client and more opportunities to really have a space that looks the way they want and to highlight the things that they want in their space.
I'm curious, about wireless and what your conversations around wireless look like with owners.
I love wireless. It's great for renovations. There is some limitations where money might be a consideration, but when you look at wireless, and you're doing a renovation, it's like, hey, I don't have to pull some type of low voltage flex down to the wall or conduit down to the wall for a wire switch. And some companies are even coming out with receptacles for 2021 IEC. You're required to control receptacle or even ASHRAE. They have some of those that are wirelessly controlled now, so you just have the line voltage going to it, and that just makes a ton of sense. And so I think if we talk with the end users and make a push for wireless, it's very good. There are some instances where it's not so great, stadium applications, things like that, where there's just a ton of signal in the area. And if you ever stand up in the middle of a stadium, you have full bars, but you can't call out. there's too much there in the area. And so I would say that's probably the limitation of wireless.
Yeah, and I think we're continuing to saturate our airwaves with more and more radio signals of different varieties, and so I think your point is valid that as we expand upon wireless outside of the lighting controls technology, we're going to have to figure out a way to share or create our own space for that.
Certainly.
Yeah, but I think there's also the worry that people have when it comes to, like, for instance, cybersecurity with wireless, and I don't know if that's come up for you in conversation before.
Not specifically. There was some concern on the city level where we had a presentation at a it was a National Society of Professional Engineers meeting, and they were presenting, some innovation in city light controls, and some of that was wireless. So there was concerns there, but from an end user experience, a lot of the wireless comes with a proprietary button-up system that end users can get, or they could just have their localized radio frequencies that are limited to a certain range. Um, I have not heard of any security concerns, especially with the proprietary system. So
Sure.
that's about
No,
all I
and
can say on that.
well, no, I mean it's good to hear because even in the omission of that, it
Mhm.
kind of flies in the face of a number of groups saying, "Oh, we need to button up cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a really big concern. Everybody's asking about it,"
Mhm.
and you're saying it's not really something people are talking about.
Right.
So I think that's really good to hear, and hopefully some of our listeners are paying attention because I think yes, cybersecurity in the right applications absolutely needs to be diligently cared for and good
Yep.
security hygiene taken. But outside of that, if you're on a proprietary protocol, for instance, good luck hacking that.
Right. Absolutely. uh, Especially with like Crestron or Lutron systems, and there's a lot of coding involved, and especially with the P.O.E, they a lot of proprietary on that side too, depending on who you get. And I've gotten to see
Hmm.
demoing of those systems before from, the rep was showing the controls from his computer at a site, 100 miles away, and we could turn the lights on and off, and he's getting texts from his friends like, "Hey, what's happening? Are you demoing today?" Like, yes. Uh, so as long as you're secure on user access, I think you'd be fine. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm curious, in going back to sort of wireless, right? Knowing that the Wi-Fi spectrum is so sort of oversaturated these
Mhm.
days, and even Bluetooth with a lot of these controls, what do you think is next? What do you think is coming in the controls industry, or what do you want to see next?
Hmm.
I'd like to see more of a hybrid system between theatrical type lighting to a standard type lighting. So what's utilized right now between those? So say for instance, if I'm doing a church, I have my general lighting controls outside, but then when I get into the worship area, now there's a whole different type of lighting controls. They got their theatrical, but they still have a general lighting in the area. But those controls have to be able to talk to each other. So a lot of times you just have contactor switches, and so I think bridging that gap is probably the next solution. And someone's going to be able to feel that, hey, we have a niche, and if you have something bigger than a worship center, if it's a hall for music and entertainment, plays, whatever, we have a whole system that's going to work everything, and I think that's the next step.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and what I would say is integration in general. But
Mhm.
I think you're right that these unique spaces need to be more integrated with the rest of the building, and I think it's the
Mhm.
same thing with any kind of unique installation like a color changing facade or a multimedia ceiling or something to that effect. Some level of integration that's more streamlined than what is currently, because you're alluding to contact closure, or RS-232 or UDP
Mhm.
commands. I mean, all of this stuff is still not ideal. The ideal would be to have the same button station, excuse me, the same button station that is controlling the same panel, that is controlling the same components for everything.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think Ron unfortunately would disagree because that's taken his work away. But
Oh no. Sorry, Ron.
Well, yes and no. No, it's okay, but yes and no, right? Because there are some times where we can kind of go into smaller projects and we can take over everything. But you get on a lot of these sites, at least larger sites, and you still can't do that. No matter, there's still going to be that
Mhm.
larger building lighting system that we have to figure out a way to integrate with. And
right,
unfortunately, it does tend to have to be RS-232 or contact closures because they don't want them on the same network because of security or this or that, right? So there's always a million limitations. So it would be nice to find easier ways to kind of blend some of these systems together sometimes, because it's not always easy. It's not always
hmm
easy.
Right.
yeah. I
Right.
mean, it's not like you get a Windows PC and another Windows PC from a different manufacturer, and they can communicate just fine together.
Hmm.
It's really, you have to construct the integration, I like to call it the handshake between the two systems,
Mm-hmm.
because they're so unrelated to each other, and they're basically thinking in their own world. And you have to say, okay, do your own thing until this happens, and then you need to change. And it feels like there's an easier way to do it than that.
Yeah. And for areas where you have to have a general, or excuse me, a uniform rather, lighting control system, you really run into those areas. Sometimes you can get away with just saying, here's a localized control for this, or
Mm.
a wireless control solution for this, and it's just this area. But if you're, as stated before, in some type of entertainment area and things have to be plugged in, it gets very difficult. A lot of times we'll just say, this was a renovation, lighting controls before pretty outdated, defunct pretty much at this point. Would you consider a new lighting control system? And that's going to be the end user call,
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think even there, integration can sometimes emerge, because they're like, well, we want to keep this side of things, but we don't, we want to remove this and replace it with a new thing. And so you have to almost be like, okay, how am I integrating with a 1960s lighting control panel? So
Right, yeah.
but yeah, so I mean, as far as from your perspective,
Mhm.
how often are you seeing these disparate installations, like a theater completely separate from the rest of the building?
I've only done one at my current employer, and most of my focus on where I'm at now is telecoms and data centers. So the lighting there is way more industrial as compared to an area where aesthetics really matter. And
Mhm.
um, for the instance that I had, thankfully the client wanted to go ahead and just put a whole new system in, so we were able to talk him into that direction. But for other areas, sometimes the argument you can argue from a code perspective. It's like you have to have these controls because you still have general lighting here. These have to be able to dim occupancy, or whatever exemptions may apply, right? You could try to argue for new lighting controls, or the best you could do is try to isolate or minimize the fixtures or things that are changing, and really work
Sure.
with that end user for what they're wanting, because at the end of the day they have a vision, but they also have a budget.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. No,
Budgets
and
are killers, man.
yeah, totally. I mean, I think, from the stance of a specification as well, it's hard to make sure that your system's going to be budget friendly, because it's not, again,
Mhm.
it's not as easy as like light fixtures, where it's like, okay, 50 of these are going to cost X. Whereas with a lighting control system, you can't just be like, okay, 50 aux sensors is X, because you have so much else behind that aux sensor that needs to support it. And so
Right,
I
yeah.
remember when I was a specifier, I would try to like create these graphics of like, okay, a simple room condition is going to be this much, a more expansive room condition is going to be this much, but it's always a juggling act.
Right, yeah, absolutely, especially for what they're wanting. And thankfully there's a bidding process, so they get to see that.
Now,
Like, okay,
out
maybe
of
we don't need
curiosity,
this. Go ahead.
with the bidding process, are you involved in that at all?
um I would say from a design point of view, we're always involved. What we put on the drawings is what the contract really usually bid. Now, they may say, hey, there's some price or something that's not built in this, and they'll try to go off a square foot number. Um,
Hmm.
that practice, I feel, is kind of falling out, and they tend to only bid to what's on the drawings now. And so
Sure.
that bid portion may come off of what's called a design level or DD set,
Mm-hmm.
in various different phases, 15 to 20 to 75 to 100%. And then after the design phase, you move into the CD phase, where you're actually connecting and verifying your systems and making sure everything's actually connected on the drawings and everything's there, so that there's 100% design into the package that the contractor is going to utilize, and that's actually going to be the numbers in the construction phase when they start moving dirt or
But
renovating ceilings. Go ahead.
but correct me if I'm wrong. From what you were saying, it
Mm.
sounds like you basically button up your CD package and then kick it out the door, and you don't find out what was bid until you get your submittals back.
Typically, yes. There are some instances where we're a little bit more, walking the hand of the end user. They may want a little bit more of our input, and of course, for them, a lot of times they're making the decision on that because they're looking from a budget process, or maybe what was recommended at the start of the project from the design engineer. So for me, say for instance, I had a church facility that I worked on. They wanted a system where they didn't really want centralized, so they wanted distributed controls, which was fine, but they still had to have network for hallways and things like that. So I gave them a hybrid system, and they said, later on we would want to be able to network with these controls down the line. And so I picked a solution for them that met that criteria. And I have those on my drawings. It's submittal level at that point, and we still have the or equivalent. And so I think at that point, that's pretty close to what you're doing. And then other things down the line usually tends to be major cost items.
Yeah. I mean, the impetus for that question is really, there's some people who say, get involved in the bidding, see if you can interview people, like, really hands-on with the bid process. But it sounds like that's not really a part of your scope, which, I mean, I would say, that's pretty much the norm. It's uncommon for a specifier to be in the room with the bidding or interviewing anybody specifically. Optimally, if you're doing an integrator, if you've required an integrator for a project, you could interview them, but that's still uncommon.
Right. And I think the saying there is for engineers, it's get the money on the paper. So that's our contribution to the bid process.
Yeah. Well, and I think to dig into that, I mean, ultimately what you're saying is make sure that all of the costs are covered on your drawings, so that way there's no surprises down the road.
Right. And when there are surprises, what you see is a chargeback order of some sort where the GC says, hey, this wasn't on the drawings, it's not part of the contract, we're going to require a little bit extra money. Then you might have an upset end user depending on how bad it is.
Right. Oh yeah, and I think we've all seen that happen at some point. In fact, Ron sometimes shows up because of that price tag.
Yep.
Oh no, yeah.
It's happened a couple times.
Well, we're almost out of time here, but I just want to kind of encapsulate what we've talked about here, because I think we've hit on a lot of topics that we've talked about before here, which is where our industry could get better at, what the typical workflow is, but from your perspective, I mean, making sure that the documentation is thorough enough to capture everything, that you've had the conversations, not just with the owner, but with the AHJ, with really anybody who has a stake in the project, whether it's somebody you're being paid to work with or not. And it sounds like even further, you document those conversations so that you can refer back to them should there be any discussion later on. But, making sure that your drawings and specifications are up to submittal level, which is I think a great goal to have in mind, because submittals really are the final review of your of what's going to get installed and implemented. So making sure that your documents are going to reflect what somebody would kick back to you during the CA process really ensures that that's there. you still kind of roll in some flexibility though, because the anticipation
Hmm.
is that a contractor may sub it out. But to your defense, you try to align your luminaire package with your controls package if you're doing a packaged system, so that it's all
Hmm.
one rep providing it, which goes
Hmm.
back to a conversation that Ron and I had with a sales rep, where they try to keep everything under one roof, because that way they can verify, hey, what luminaire did you provide for type A, and then they can coordinate all of that. And to your point, you were saying that that way the protocols are really verified and are
Hmm.
working to the luminaire strength. Or if it's a proprietary system, all the better, because you have proprietary components embedded in those luminaires that you can't control with anybody else's system. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
you're really like you said, you're capturing the money on the paper, because otherwise, if somebody were to substitute a different lighting control system and you have proprietary components, suddenly those proprietary components are getting removed, replaced by generic components, and then you need another component alongside that. So it really
Hmm.
expands and blows up the cost of the project at times. But I think from your perspective, it's really an ongoing conversation. It's I think again we're seeing this practice die out, where you take the system you used in the previous project and just carry it over to the next project.
Hmm.
What you're saying is really you need to custom tailor it every single time, and you need to make a decision. What are you aligning your lighting control system to? Which I really like your practice of aligning to the luminaire rep.
Hmm.
I don't think that's applicable in every single case, and I think everybody's got their own
Right.
workflow, but it works for you, which is great. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
think, again, people just need to think through their workflow and expand upon it, and really decide, okay, what are we doing? How are we making this decision? Instead of, the old adage of pick the brand and stay with it.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And I've used a range of different providers and stuff, and so what I say at the end of the day is the ease of communication is probably the best thing. Have communication is great, and you really get that when you have common sourced lighting and controls from a similar rep, and because between different companies, communication could vary. You know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is a risk, and I think depending on the care that the whichever rep ends up being second is what that is more valuable, because the
Mhm.
say for instance the luminaire package gets assembled and kicked out the door for production.
Mm.
It's the lighting controls rep in that case that needs to pay attention and go, okay, what are the submittals for the luminaires? Whereas it could be
Right.
the other way around. It could be that the lighting controls are already out the door, and that then the luminaire package rep needs to pay attention and go, well, what are you providing for this fixture? And
Right. Yeah.
so,
And oftentimes they don't. Unfortunately, the lighting rep, the work for them tends to flow down. It's I have my luminaires and there's the controls. That's fine at the start of the project, but if you decide to change the luminaires down the line and maybe dimming protocol changes or something else changes, they really need to communicate that down to the controls so we can get updates from there as well, because the engineer can only flow traffic so much. These type of updates have to happen
Right.
on the fly. So if you have a company that has a lighting control sister company or whatever that they work with, hopefully they're passing that along, and we're getting both those updates back at the same time.
yeah, because otherwise it's a coordination nightmare.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Well, Caleb, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really good stuff. Hopefully our listeners got a lot out of this conversation, but I really enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll have you back on in the future to give us updates on how you're progressing and anything new in the industry. But thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me on.
Well, that was a really cool conversation. I hope you guys got a lot out of it. I certainly did. Really interesting to hear how different specifiers handle the different workflows that are out there. There is no one perfect solution for every single
Mm.
project, and so it's really interesting to hear how it varies. Hopefully you also agree with that perspective, but if you don't, let us know. Come on the show. But anyways, just want to let you know this episode is presented by the Lighting Controls Association.
And financially supported by NAIL, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And I think we might have to have a greater conversation, Webster, about Cat 5 terminations versus terminal blocks, because if you're not doing it right, then sure, I guess Cat 5 could take longer. But I have some pretty strong opinions about that, the ways Cat 5 can be a faster termination than a terminal block in the right applications, and if you're using the right tools. And I will gladly give sales pitch to the right company because I know who I like to use. But anyway, be sure to check out the website if you haven't. Follow us on all the social media platforms. Follow us on your favorite streaming platform. And Caleb, thank you again so much. It was a great conversation. We'll see you guys soon.